Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. This is the last of my father-son pairs for this year, and delighted to have Ron and Khyber Oser on. Auction veterans. Ron, my contemporary, known him for 4 decades, I think, and Khyber, I can't have known him for 4 decades because he's barely 4 decades, but two sharp guys, had a lot in common and had a similar journey, but then they're their own men as well. So I really enjoyed it. I hope you do too. Thanks sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, ComC.com, Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. So Ron and Khyber were both with Huggins & Scott for a long time, but Khyber now is with Golden, and Ron went over with when Huggins & Scott was acquired by REA. So still representing Bill Huggins' legacy well. So thanks, guys, and here's my discussion with them. Okay, welcome, Ron and Khyber Oser, longtime hobby veterans. Both of y'all have been involved in the auction game since I've known you, but you have a different approach to it. Khyber, you've been doing these catalog write-ups, and my first question to you is, what percentage increase in the price comes from a superb catalog write-up? If you're writing something up, embellishing it, hyperbolizing it, how much does it matter?
This probably isn't the answer you're looking for. I don't go into it thinking that it's going to raise the price. I go into it thinking, how can I best serve the consignor? I want to dig into the history, tell the story of the item. I want the consignor to feel good that we gave it its best shot to go big. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. The auction industry is unpredictable. But if I know that I've done right by the consignor, then that's what I'm looking for.
I've read your stuff. You're really excellent. But I'm just thinking, you also want the bidders to not feel like you're exaggerating, that they're disappointed when they get something. But some of these items are primo items.
I have to believe in the item to sell it. I'm an earnest person. So I don't have as much to say if I don't dig into the research, and I don't want to tell someone something they can see themselves. I want information they're not going to know if they're breezing through a catalog. I want to find out about this little piece of signage in the Ebbets Field background, or this sleeve patch and why that's important to the Yankees Golden. I never want to talk about Lou Gehrig's legacy. I want to talk about what he was doing that day, that year, get very specific and granular.
How's that different from your dad? Because your dad is very well versed in cards of all kinds. Do you dig deeper? Is Ron more of a generalist?
When I got into the hobby was 2002, and my dad had always been doing cataloging, but for him it was more like listing sets. It wasn't really as much like creative writing. I had an English degree out of Penn State, and I had this writing background, and any of the hobby stuff I could learn. So I came in with kind of a leg up, because most of the guys who were writing back at that time were hobby guys without an English background.
And back then it was a lot more cards than it was memorabilia. Probably they're equal now. But the thing is, that 33 Goudy Ruth that's behind you that people have written up 18,000 times, different ones, even though they're worth tens of thousands of dollars, it's much different than an advertising piece discovered for the first time in the walls of somebody's house from the early 1900s, where you can really do research. And I wouldn't say that was me back in the day. I was more dealing with 56 top sets, and how much can you say about them? You just have to grade them and shoot them properly. But the skill and the interest is much more in things people don't know about than that people already know about, which circles back to, what can you say about a 56 top set that'll get you more money than any other one? Almost nothing. But to find out where something came from that no one's seen and why, that's the interesting part of all this.
Also, my dad's a big reader, and in his day wrote some poetry. So he appreciates good writing. And I learned at the feet of my dad, and also Bill Mastro, who used to read every single write-up in the catalog in those early 2000s and really understood how he used to say, "Make me cry, Khyber." He really wanted me to get to the heart of the emotion of why collectors care about their pieces.
Bill gets a bad rap in a lot of ways. He loved cards too much, maybe. He was so into it, so knowledgeable, so passionate.
He really took me under his wing and taught me how to tell the story.
So both you guys light up when something that's more obscure gets your motor revved more than the basic stuff?
I think when you've been doing it as long as we've been doing it, or I've been doing it, it's the thrill of the hunt at this point and discovering new collections and new things than the rote work of writing, photography, research. It's really the thrill. Or there's certain people in the hobby that I've been trying to get collections from for 30 years. If I got those collections, it would be heartwarming, not just speaking financially, just breaking them down. There's an art to breaking down collections for an auction house. So that's the two things that I enjoy, finding this stuff and breaking it down so it works for the consignor.
Jim, I'm not really a businessman type. I'm really a writer at heart. Sometimes I feel Michael Corleone in The Godfather. I feel like I grew up in this field and I know a lot at this point, and I got sucked into it. I never thought I'd be doing this, but at this stage, with all the writing behind me, now I'm doing more and more sales like my dad does. Now I'm getting the collections, and then I'm also writing them. But it's interesting that I'm really following in his footsteps, and it's not what I ever would have imagined myself doing at this point in my life.
You guys have brought up something interesting that applies to me as well, and that is that in your write-ups, Khyber, are you trying to acknowledge the pedigree or the provenance? Ron was saying a 56 top set, but if this was Frank Nagy's 56 top set, but that could be hearsay. How do you establish some of those things, or can you speculate on that? How close to the vest do you play some of those things? Because that would make a big difference with some fabulous collections out there if we knew it came from there.
We always do the best we can to get a notarized letter or something from the family, some acknowledgement. I do think those details are important. In fact, I really love hobby historic things like copies of ACC or like Trader Speaks. I think there's a future market for that hasn't really come to fruition.
When I sold the company, I left all my very extensive and very complete collection of hobby publications. I left it there. And partly that's because Rich was there and I thought maybe they'll use it for research. The new owners had zero interest in that. And at some point, they didn't have enough interest in Rich to keep him around. I don't know if they dumped him or they got lost or pitched, but I had complete runs of all these things. And of course, I'm a researcher, cataloger like you guys in that same sense. That's the original, when it came out, material, source material.
I like early show posters too.
Oh, yeah.
We were lucky enough, my dad and I, to work together on some promoter collections like Bob Schmurer.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and there's so much history there. I didn't expect to tell this story, but 10 or 15 years ago, I had this idea in my head that I wanted to go around and interview hobbyists for an oral history of the hobby. And I thought I was well placed to do this because some of the people in the hobby that don't get along, I get along with them. So like I could talk to Bill and people aren't friends with Bill. And someone who's not always well loved, but is loved by others is I was living in New Mexico and I went and interviewed Lou Lipsett for hours.
Yeah.
Had fascinating conversations that I still have recorded. But I was younger, I was getting married, I was having kids, and I never got off the ground. But I appreciate all the hobby pioneers that came before us.
Well, that's called a podcast now. You could put that out. And Lou was so helpful to me in all the pre-war stuff, on everything. He was a type collector as well as an exhaustive collector and a researcher and a really smart guy. But he was cantankerous.
Lou was my mentor as far as vintage cards. I used to just spend days at his house.
Jim, do you know how my dad got into cards?
I think, Ron, I've known you for 40 years.
Yes, you have.
But you're older than 40.
I started in the hobby in 1979.
That's the year I was born.
And my first annual price guide.
My first hobby work was with comic books. I opened one of the first comic book stores in the East Coast in the mid-1970s. And I ended up having retail stores and did comic book conventions.
But here's what was bold, if I can interrupt. That he called the store Comics for Collectors. That was a leap at that time. Comics weren't for collectors. Comics were for readers.
There was a guy named Phil Suling, who old comic book people would know as like the father of comic auctions and comic collecting. And he was a mentor also and a good friend who passed too early. But I was at a comic book show in 1979 but I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan growing up in Philadelphia, and Duke Snider and Sandy Koufax were my heroes. And I was walking through a comic book show where I was set up at, and I saw a little Duke Snider baseball card in this guy's comic book showcase. And it was a 49 Bowman Snider, his rookie card, and it was $10. As a novelty, I bought it. My instinct was, wow, Duke Snider, because I was 7 years old when that was out, and I remember the Bowmans. And a year later or something like that, somebody offered me $100 for it. I sold it thinking I could replace it, and that turned into eventually within a year or so having more cards in my comic book store than comic books.
Jim, the most important thing you need to know about us is that we are unicorns in this hobby because neither of us collect anything.
Grandchildren in my case.
Has that always been true, or is it recently true?
I collected high-grade tobacco cards for a while before grading.
I have no recollection of that.
Yeah. I collected T206s and 5s and Turkey Reds, and I loved them, and I only collected them in high grade. And I sold them all when grading first started, probably 30 years ago. As most collectors lament, most older collectors sold them too soon.
If you sold too soon, other than maybe 2 years ago or something.
My dad loves the Dalai Lama and has some interest in impermanence and like Buddhism. For me, I was a big sports fan growing up, but today I don't really watch a lot of sports for someone who works in the auction industry. I care about sports history, but I also don't really want the conflict of interest that comes from being a buyer and seller of the things that I write and handle.
I think that's an important point. One of the challenges in our company is when you're doing price guides back in the 70s and 80s and 90s and throughout, is that we wanted to have collectors that really understood the cards and the sports and all that, but they couldn't really be dealers. They could have a favorite player, but we didn't want people making a market when they were involved in trying to diagnose what was going on in the hobby shops of America.
It's like jury selection.
It's tricky, yeah, but I think it's an edge, and it is a unicorn kind of thing to be passionate about an industry and not be a collector or a dealer, but to be able to assist others. I think it's noble and it's great, but that's the road less traveled.
I think we both enjoy connecting people, connecting buyers and sellers. We call our clients or consignors our friends. I think we develop longstanding friendly relationships with the people we work with.
I love that. But Khyber, how many different affiliations have you guys had? Because there's been consolidation and name changes and things like that within the industry. You guys have not been job hoppers, but you've worked for different entities.
We have a mutual friend, Kit Young, you and I. And back in the day, Kit used to have his show once a year in Hawaii. I would travel over there sometimes with my wife, Janet. On one of those trips, I met Josh Evans, who was starting to do the first really auctions that we know as auctions. That was my first auction house job. I kept my stores at the time, but I worked at Leland's in the earliest days of auctions. And that was quite interesting. Josh was quite the character, as some of us know.
He mellowed later.
He did mellow later.
I remember we were doing phone auctions and I would work for my dad. I would work out of Rob Lifson's apartment. We had big boards on the walls and we would go and write up the bids as the calls came in. But I think what Steinbach and Mastro, I'm thinking that was like mid 90s, and it was right around then that websites were coming out. So I think that's what launched the auctions as we know them today.
With the slick catalogs.
Yeah.
Because before that, it was a couple pages in Trader Speaks or SCD or something.
To backtrack a bit, I worked for Josh for not much more than a year. It was a difficult job at the time. And then I went to Robert Edward Auctions, and I worked with Rob for a few years, and then Rob and Bill merged their auctions, and I worked with the two of them.
Let me add, when I was in high school, there was like a three-way business, and my dad's business was called Ron and Khyber Oser Enterprises. And he had the good fortune of a Wagner card, which made me notable at school because kids saw my dad on TV with a Wagner card.
This is true.
Very cool.
To continue my auction houses, Rob and Bill lasted a couple years together. And then I had to make a choice when they split up, and I went with Bill instead of Rob, and I worked with Maspro Auctions. And that's when it really became big time catalogs and the beginning of the internet.
And September 11th happened around that time.
9/11 happened. Yeah.
And it was
Legendary Auctions, which were hung out.
my dad and I have worked together since up until last year. After Legendary, we were at Huggins and Scott.
So, yeah, I've been around 40 years in the auctions. And now I came full circle because Huggins and Scott became a division of Robert Edward Auctions. So go figure.
But when that happened, I went over to Golden, where I had previously freelanced, and that's where I am now. And I'm mainly working on Type 1 photos because that's where my history is, because I was a writing gun for hire in 2005 when Marshall and Henry were looking for a writer. So the three of us linked up, and I always loved photos, but I had no idea at the time that I would forever be associated with that book and that it would be such a jumping off point for that whole market. They knew everything. I did not. But now I have pretty good muscle memory, and I just love writing photos, to be honest.
The man